Yeah, so my name's Antonio. I'm actually born and raised in San Francisco, and got involved in urban agriculture a little over 10 years ago because of various things, but I'm basically looking to figure out how to change the food system and the political system and the economic system and the social system and the cultural system and so on and so forth, but using food as the vehicle for changing all these things. And so I was invited, thank you, to give a little bit of an overview, a broad.
My water.
Get your water. Get your water. I guess just a broad overview of sort of the history of agriculture in San Francisco, and then where we're at now in terms of urban agriculture as sort of a means towards food justice and towards food sovereignty. So what kind of organizing is already being done, and what potentially folks can plug into. So just historically, I think we all have to start with acknowledging that, agriculture is not a foreign thing to cities, and that we've pretty much always lived with some form of agriculture in most city urbanized environments. And in the case of San Francisco, there was large parts of the city, mostly in the south, because the city sort of arised. I don't even know the past tense. It came up as a city along the north sort of side and around the Mission, and then more during the Gold Rush era in what we consider the sort of downtown zone. And besides being a center for taking products from all over the state and actually the whole West Coast, San Francisco became very much the center of empire at a certain point in the late 19th century. There was a lot of agriculture happening in San Francisco. So mostly, as I was saying, in the south side, so where McLaren Park currently is, used to be a lot of farms, and there was a lot of, at that time it was mostly what we'd call European immigrants and various folks from those ethnic backgrounds who were doing a lot of that farming. There was also, of course, a large Chinese population since very early on in the city's history, and so there were also some Chinese agriculturists, but actually the Chinese were mostly responsible for a lot of the fishing that was going on in the area that's called China Basin, China Beach. These are related to that history. So the point is just that, some of this agricultural area has been slightly retained, that some of that history remains, and there's actually some greenhouses that are from the early 20th century that were they were operational from the late 19th century, late the 1800s, all the way until sometimes as late as the 50s and 60s. And they were commercial greenhouses. So urban agriculture is not something that's just a new thing, but you could say it is pretty new in the sense that the kinds of urban agriculture we see now are very different. And while there still might be a lot of people producing sort of at a family scale in a backyard sense for personal consumption, there's not a lot of market gardening. There's only one sort of for-profit or commercial urban farm that I know of. It's called Little City Gardens, and it's out on Cayuga and Cotter, which is out in the sort of Excelsior Mission Terrace district. And you're welcome to visit there. They're very interested in having visitors. Their whole notion was they were trying to explore what it would mean to try to create a livelihood as an urban farmer in San Francisco. It was an experiment to see if that would happen, and what I've been told by the founders of the project, one of whom actually moved up north to a much more rural environment, is that basically it doesn't work. The cost of living is incredibly high here. The cost of land is incredibly high. It's very difficult to make any sort of actual livelihood as a full-time farmer in San Francisco. So I think that's just an important thing to keep in mind. So what do we have in terms of, you had a question?
I just wanted to hear the name of the farm again.
It's called Little City Gardens.
Okay,
and their website I think is just littlecitygardens.org. And yeah, they're very open about it. I don't know how much they're pretty transparent in terms of like, this is what we've been trying to do. They've actually moved towards more of a model of growing flowers in addition to food crops, because they found that that's more sort of lucrative in certain ways. So with that said, I just wanted to point out that most of the projects that I've been involved in, and then most of the projects that I would be here to tell you about, are more projects driven by less commercial intent than sort of the idea of whether either food justice, food sovereignty, or just sort of food politics awareness. People getting an understanding of what a food system is or what food production looks like on a small scale with organic methods in ways that are supposed to be respectful of the planet. And most of the projects are really based around getting people plugged into that and getting people exposed to that experience in one way or another, or and other goals include things like providing food security or food access for healthy foods to people who might not have access because of economic issues. And we all know that there's sort of a food apartheid that exists in our society, where the rich, the elite that can walk down Valencia Street and pick any number of restaurants with very, very well-sourced ingredients that were grown to high specifications of all sorts, but it's priced out of the means of most of us average people who are working class. And so that apartheid, that food apartheid, is something that a lot of people are really interested in addressing. And so the projects that I would promote, or say, that are open for people's involvement, are ones like the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Center's People's Gardens. So these are gardens that are run by residents of a lot of low-income and middle-income housing, and even just people who live in the different apartment buildings, SROs, etc., in the Tenderloin, which is one of the last remaining areas where people have not been completely priced out. And these gardens are ways for people to basically work on their own sort of food culture. So there's a lot of ownership of the gardens themselves. They're not people. Some people volunteer and are being told what to do, but a lot of people from the residents are actually the leaders in the gardens themselves. So that's a good example. There's also examples of gardens like the Adam Rogers Garden and other gardens run by this group called Hunters Point Family and Girls 2000, which is a project that works mostly with young women from that community, from the Hunters Point community, mostly African American girls who are, in all sorts of situations of mental, basically confronting issues from school to other forms of institutionalization, to institutionalized racism, to poverty, all the usual litany of issues that confront someone who has very little in terms of economic resources. And so this project is really focused on leadership development among these young women through the act of gardening. So it's not about getting them to become gardeners necessarily, or food gardeners, but it's more about that sort of general political awareness, general cultural transformations. And unfortunately, the friend of mine who was involved in running that project, she's left the project recently, but Brandy Mack, and she does a lot of education around sort of working specifically with people that look like her but have very different backgrounds and experiences, and being able to share how she's learned over her trajectory in order to become sort of a role model for how things can be different for these young women. And she has some good stories about that. So that's another example. Another example that I was very involved with was Alemany Farm. So Alemany Farm is a 3.5 acre farm in the Bernal Heights neighborhood, so just south of the Mission. And it has a long history, which I won't really go into, but essentially there was an organization I did want to mention. So there was an organization called the San Francisco League of Urban Gardeners, which was in existence essentially throughout the 80s and most of the 90s, and it sort of fell apart in the early 2000s. And it fell apart because it got sort of absorbed into the local political machine. Willie Brown, who was a very corrupt mayor at one point, he essentially decided that he really liked this project, which is, sometimes that happens. And he funded it a lot, but he also basically manipulated to get people in his circle into positions of power within the organization. And there's all sorts of narratives about why they went away, but the sort of nail in the coffin was when Gavin Newsom was campaigning for mayor the first time, and people within Slug who were part of a jail to work program. So these were folks who were getting paroled from jail, and they were given these jobs in different nonprofit agencies as part of their parole. And those who were working for Slug were told by their supervisors that if they did not campaign and vote for Gavin Newsom, that they would be fired and then basically have to go back to jail. So that was they got these 4, 5, or 6 of these workers whistle blew to the Chronicle, and the Chronicle made a report about it, and it basically caused Slug to shut down. So I'm telling you all this because I was involved in a project that basically took a site that had been run by Slug and abandoned, in about 2002, and we started it back up as Alemany Farm in 2005, and it's been running since then as an all-volunteer run project that's really dedicated to these three main missions: are growing food and food security for both volunteers who come and work, as well as the local community that's adjacent to the farm, doing environmental education, so we host all sorts of school groups and different groups of adults and school-age children, and doing sort of more community organizing around issues of food and food access. So that project continues, and that's something that I encourage people to go check out, because it's got regular open hours where you can show up as a volunteer, you can learn about the process of growing food, you can ask questions, you can become part of the management team if you're really that interested, just by going regularly and showing that you're committed to it. The way the management team was set up is supposed to be very open to people. And it's technically on Recreation and Parks Department land, but it's run sort of semi-autonomously by this volunteer management group. So those are some projects. I think I would like to mention another one is there's an organization in this very building called Poder, and they have a program called the Urban Campesinos, and that's a youth-driven program that came up partly to implement a new opportunity they got in partnering with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, who have this huge 5-acre piece of land, so that's even bigger than Alemany Farm, which is itself the largest urban farm in San Francisco. They were given permission to develop a community farm on this piece of land, which is even farther south, in the south side of the Excelsior. And it's a really inspiring project, because they're bringing together in the Excelsior, which is one of, like the Tenderloin, it's one of the few neighborhoods that has not been sort of completely gentrified, and that there's a lot of families, a lot of working class people who still live there, and it's actually extremely ethnically and culturally diverse. And so there's a lot of different people who, sometimes immigrants, sometimes not, who have very strong food cultures, but don't necessarily have space to grow food. And so the project is envisioned as a way of bringing folks together within that neighborhood to cultivate and maintain those food cultures and share those food cultures, and gain a little bit of this idea of autonomy over the food system through the act of growing. And also there's a really strong premium, I like to say, this is what's really inspiring to me about it, is that they have a really strong premium on community governance structure. So they're going to manage this garden, this farm, as a community, and figure out ways to do it together, collectively in a sort of sense of solidarity, rather than have some outside agency manage it, which is what a lot of times happens in urban garden projects. I wanted to give a little bit, I'm going to go, now that I'm in the present, I'm going to go back to the past a little bit, because I think the history of community gardens in San Francisco is sort of emblematic about how a lot of times community energy does get sort of absorbed by the city, and sometimes that institutionalization that happens in that process is I mean, nothing is purely good or bad, but sometimes it's good in terms of the resources it can provide for urban farming, but then the way it sort of takes the control and the governance out of the hands of the community sometimes is not so great. And so a great example is what there was basically a lot of garden spaces that started illegally, or just as people taking land that was available to grow food. So one example I have is the Potrero Hill Community Garden on I guess that's the west side of Potrero Hill, right above where the freeway now runs. So in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a pretty substantial Filipino population living on the hill, and there was a Filipino woman who just decided to start gardening this land that was very close to her house, that was overlooking the side of this hill. And basically she started gardening the land, and then other people who were in the neighborhood were curious about it, and they sort of all assumed that she owned the land because she was gardening, so she owned the place. And through this process, people just began to create this larger community garden. And I think I use the term community garden sort of casually, because we all assume we know what we mean by community gardens, but the reality is obviously there's different kinds of community gardens and there's different kinds of communities. But in this case, it really was a community garden in the sense that people were just starting to organically work together in this garden. And then over time, it sort of overlapped with the larger process that was happening in the city. So there was city and actually national forces that are important here. So on the city level, we had a sort of progressive leadership in Sir George Moscone, who was the mayor, who was shot alongside Harvey Milk. he was really a fan of this idea of like the city taking ownership over green space and actually developing green space for the use of by the citizens. So he put up money to actually support a few garden supporters, basically, I don't remember how many positions, like 2 or 3 positions around the city, who would help local community residents setting up gardens. So that was a level of support for gardens like this one, which were actually illegal at first. They also had money at some point, this site, which was, I believe it must have, I don't actually know if it was privately owned or city owned, but somehow it got legalized in this process where the city actually said, okay, we're gonna take this thing, which was essentially a squatted garden, and make it a legitimate community garden. At the same time, the federal influence that happened was there was a program called CETA, and I can't remember what it stands for now, but essentially it was a national work program, sort of like they have the VISTA program now. There's various programs federally funded that enable people to do different kinds of work in communities, whether it's be teachers or work in healthcare, this or that. So in this case, this one was funding folks to actually be gardeners and to develop garden projects that were food producing. And so there was a lot of people whose labor was being paid for by the federal government to develop gardens. So the Potrero Hill example is just one, but there are various community gardens around the city that were started by people who just took land and then were legitimized through the combination of the city project as well as the funding that was available to work the land or to manage to be in positions of sort of stewardship that was funded by the federal government. And that happened throughout the 70s. That was from 1973 to 1977, I think, 6 or 7. And then because, you know, the mayor was shot, someone else who was in city government who was supported left the city, various things shifted. Dianne Feinstein became mayor, and she immediately, this was also during that recession. There's periodic recessions, but there was one in the 70s, and essentially they had to cut different parts of the budget, and this community garden program was one of the ones that was cut. And so a lot of these gardens went into periods of neglect, or they were only maintained to the extent that the community members were able to do it on their own. And it wasn't until SLUG formed out of that. There are some of the members who started SLUG, the San Francisco League of Urban Gardeners. They actually were involved in some of these gardens, and they said, hey, we don't want to see this momentum go away. And there still was some of this federal funding available, but there needed to be a local sort of agency to take on the funds. So they fulfilled that role. They organized for a few years and then created this broad network for across the city. And that worked for most of the 80s, where SLUG was really the go-to organization doing gardening all around the city. And part of that was, well, what I think is beautiful about it is that they really were representing the actual true diversity of the city. The city has a lot of different kinds of people living in it, or did at that time especially, and those folks from different areas and different backgrounds were able to still have access to space and be able to grow food. And it was SLUG's sort of downfall that created a sort of a vacuum where there was a lot of these spaces, but there wasn't a lot of resourcing or organizational support for them. And then the city decided it had to take control over it, but then it put it into this Recreation and Parks Department, which, if you're not familiar with, is probably one of the worst run city departments in terms of their attitudes towards community. They essentially don't want to have anything to do with volunteer groups or groups that are doing things for sort of social justice ends. They might have the rhetoric, but they're really a pretty horrible bureaucracy. And under the recent administration, they're increasingly into privatization of our public spaces and other not so great things. And so the community gardens program under Recreation and Parks Department got really horrible, where certain gardens had years-long waiting lists, and they're run on a plot-by-plot basis. Remember I was saying different kinds of community gardens, right? You can have a community garden where no one really does anything in community. Basically, you just have your individual plots and people go grow their own plots, and then there's someone whose job it is to be the garden coordinator who deals with water and other issues that come up. But essentially, people don't really work together on anything. And so a lot of the community gardens were becoming like that under the management of Recreation and Parks Department. And actually, when we started Alemany Farm, Recreation and Parks Department, which had nothing to do with running the farm when it was under SLUG, they told us that we had to start managing it as a community garden, they told us we couldn't do this, we couldn't do that, we couldn't do that because those aren't allowed in the community garden regulations that they had set up, some 100-something pages of regulations that they set up to establish how a community garden must be run. But the reality is if you go across the city to many of these community gardens, even though there's high waiting lists, you see plots where there's barely anything growing. Partly because I think people don't really know what they're doing, partly because people don't have a lot of time, partly because there's not a lot of this institutional support, so people aren't growing starts for them, so people are growing a tomato seed, and sometimes it's more efficient to actually grow a start first and then plant it. So there's various reasons, but the point is that the space isn't really accessible to the community in a broad sense very much, and it's also not being really well run in terms of production of food. So it's sort of an unfortunate case, and that's changing a little bit because there's been pressure by some community gardening activists. Namely, there's an organization I was involved in founding called the San Francisco Urban Agriculture Alliance. And another thing, you guys are welcome to get involved. It was intended originally as a sort of a coalition to bring together all the folks who are doing all this on-the-ground work and be able to have more leverage in the realm of city politics, and as well as just share resources and be sort of more cohesive as a community of practice. And we pressured the city to create a more functional urban agriculture support system, and they actually created a program which, even though we the experts recommended they did not house in Recreation and Parks Department because of their bad track record, they chose to put it there anyway. And so I will say that at least they hired someone to manage that program who came from doing a lot of on-the-ground food justice or organizing projects, and so she's at least, not just another bureaucrat from the department already who got the position, and she's done some good things in terms of creating resource centers and providing lots of workshops, opportunities, and doing things to try to help people actually run. And then they've also finally funded someone to work specifically on community gardens in the sense of like actually making sure all the plots are being used well, making sure that the wait lists are being functionally managed so that they're actually getting folks who are interested into having gardens into the spaces. So I think things are sort of improving on that front, but in general, the city is experiencing a destruction of urban gardens rather than a production of them in the last few years because of the intense displacement epidemic and the intense pressure of development on any available open space. So Hayes Valley Farm, I don't know if anyone ever been to Hayes Valley Farm or heard of Hayes Valley Farm, but that was an interim use of a site that used to be where the freeway actually touched down, and it ended up being it was basically slated for luxury housing, but the mayor's office of housing basically gave a grant to some activist folks to start it up as a farm, and it went as an educational urban farm for about 2.5 years before the construction on these new luxury housing happened. But Hayes Valley Farm is gone. There's another place called the Free Farm, which is associated with the Free Farm Stand. So the Free Farm Stand gives away what they call heck of local produce, so produce that's gleaned from around San Francisco and the Bay Area, real produce that's grown in people's backyards, as well as leftover produce from the organic farmers market at the Ferry Building, and they give it away for free. And there's no means testing. They don't ask you to prove your income or anything like that, because it's really about people providing for each other and people being sort of into the idea of freely sharing in a sort of gift economy. And so the Free Farm was another farm up on Gough Street that actually produced bulk of food that went straight to this Free Farm Stand every week in the Mission 23rd and Treat. The Free Farm Stand still runs every Sunday from 1 to 3, I think, 23rd and Treat. So anyone's welcome to check that out as well and talk to the guy who started that project. His name is Tree, and he's a longtime urban gardener in San Francisco. So I mean, I don't want to seem too down on what's going on in San Francisco lately, but it's just in terms of Alemany Farm and from my experience, it's very, very difficult to maintain that sort of activist energy when the people who would, give their time to try to produce food as a sort of, as an activist thing, a lot of folks just don't have the time anymore when they're trying to hustle just to survive in a very, very expensive city like San Francisco. Or they're people who have already been evicted or priced out or basically forced to leave to other areas. And so I'm no longer involved in Alemany Farm. I haven't been for a few, 3 or 4 years, very seriously. And and I know that it continues, and I know that it's still a volunteer-driven group, but most of the main people who are working and really holding down the food production are actually retired people who already have their sort of established livelihoods in San Francisco, their spaces paid for. So I think that there's something to be said about that, whereas, you know, when I was involved, there was definitely a lot more idealistic young people, you know, who were really driving that project. So there's still some projects, like I said, and I would encourage people to get involved in the Crocker Amazon project. That's not yet a farm, but is being constructed as one now. That's Poder's project, the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Council, and their People's Gardens are pretty great. I would encourage people to check out Alemany Farm just to see what it's like. And, you know, and sometimes it's possible to start other projects. You know, it's not that there's no land, it's just very, very difficult to find land that's not already heavily coveted. So yeah, I think that's all I got to say for now. So any questions or comments are welcome.
I've read of some cities where abandoned buildings are turned into greenhouses. Obviously, there are questions about energy, like the lights to grow the plants and so forth. But that can come from solar panels. But of course, there's costs associated with that. Anyway, is there any project like that in San Francisco, or is there people talked about it, thought about it?
Yeah. I remember I went to one Urban Agriculture Alliance meeting where there was multiple people there who were sort of in startup phases of that sort of project. I've been hearing about a lot of, vertical urban farming, they call it, or, rooftop greenhouses, a lot of stuff that like hydroponics and aquaponics and a lot of more sort of high-tech, you would say, growing methods. And I will be critical of those things. I mean, for one, I've never seen a functional version of this. I've only heard about it in terms of like, oh, we're going to be doing this. Whereas I've seen people produce large amounts of food from the ground again and again. So I feel like, to me, the proof is in the pudding sort of thing. Like, I'd like to see one of these systems that's actually working and actually functional. And those questions you raised about energy consumption, about sort of the ethical, environmental angle, like, are even less certain. I mean, I'm questioning whether they actually produce very much food in the first place, and then the next step is whether they're energy efficient or whether they're economical, those kind of things. The second critique I have is that most of the people that I've seen associated with that angle are more basically investment interest. Like, there's people who literally came to our meeting and were like, we're here because we want to invest in urban farming. We think that that's the next sort of cool business opportunity. And coming from a social justice perspective, I thought that's not my interest whatsoever. I mean, I think that there's actually really good examples. If you want a really inspirational example of an urban farming project, one of my favorites is called Planting Justice. They're based in Oakland, and their model is amazing because they do for-profit things and non-profit things in the same organization. And so they're really driven by sort of an oppression analysis, a power analysis. They're into political education internally in their organization as well as externally. They're into integrating rather than segregating these different models. And so concretely what that means is they have a project where they started with a Transform Your Yard project. So they do installations of food producing gardens for private homeowners, and those are full cost. So for every 3 full cost ones they do for some relatively rich person in Berkeley, say, they do one subsidized for free installation for a low-income person. And then, so that's one model that they do to achieve their ends of serving all sorts of people. And then, at the same time, they work with various institutions. So they work with an old folks home, and they do a garden education program there that they get paid somewhat for, or they do a program with a school, and they do get some sort of funds for that. They get small grants for small projects. They also do a project in San Quentin Prison where they've been working with prisoners and doing permaculture curriculum with prisoners. And now they've gone to the point where they're working with a group called Pathways to Resilience, where essentially the folks that they work with in the prisons, mostly men, who have done their program in the prisons, when they get paroled and come out of prison, they're offered a full living wage job doing the Transform Your Yard work with the organization. And part of that being part of that is you're actually part of a community where you talk about social justice issues, you talk about the prison industrial complex, you talk about injustices not just within the food system but within housing. You know, it's a full spectrum program where they're also looking at fundraising grassroots. So they go door to door in the communities that they work with and actually raise money from the people they're trying to work with, not just from foundations or government or, you know. And so they have this very diversified income stream, and they're talking to people in many different ways, and they're communicating and working with many different kinds of people. Their staff, if you look at it, even though it was started by like a white guy in his 30s, the staff is incredibly diverse, and the functional organization in terms of governance is actually based on many people and not just this one guy. So to me, that's a model of like, you could do functional urban agriculture that achieves social justice goals, and you can make money with certain parts of your production, right? It's not that you can't make money and do social justice, but this whole thing of like vertical farming, to me, it's like skipping the first step. It's just going straight to like, can we make money off of it? And I don't think it's even proven. That's what my concern.
So my question is a little bit related to that, and actually I'm happy that you mentioned Little City Farm or Garden, because hopefully they can participate tomorrow. But I'm very interested about this question of it not being profitable, not being able to make a livelihood. Do you believe that it's more a question of density of growth, or is it more of just needing square area? Or is it a little bit of both? What percentage?
The reason why farming, or like urban farming, so here's one thing I'll point out is that farming itself is not profitable. So if you look at the US, for example, the super large majority of farms in terms of numbers are small scale farms, meaning these are, you know, with less than 100 acres. They're small farms. Of course, it depends on what products you're talking about, but let's say fruits and vegetables, right? Most people who are farming sustain their farm because of outside income. So of the vast majority of the number of farms in the US, most of them only survive economically because one or two of the operators also has some sort of off-farm income. And so that points to the fact that the food system at large is not really functional for the producers. And this is another thing that it relates to the mainstream sort of critique, the alternative critique to the mainstream food system, which is mainstream in itself, is that, you know, these mainstream farmers in the Midwest are destroying the planet and they're making tons of money from growing corn and soy, right? And that's not true either. The farmers themselves, the people who, even though they're family farms, meaning that their land is owned within a family, not by a corporation, they're still managing 10,000 acres. And every acre of corn they plant, they actually lose money. And the only way they get more than the cost of production is because they have this subsidy from the government. So we critique the subsidies, but in reality, that's the only way that these people actually make any profit, and they're not usually making that much profit, because the people that are making the profits are those who are buying that crop for less than the cost of production, right? So I guess what I'm trying to point out to here is that all farming is skewed by the political economic system that rewards the intermediaries and these large corporate conglomerates that actually they suck all the value from the food system between the producer and us, the consumer, right? And so urban farming is less lucrative, only more so because of that issue. Scale you mentioned, it's just you don't have that much land, but also because I mean, at least in San Francisco, just the cost of living. It's really more about, you know, when we look at our conventional food system, even most of the organic farms we have, what's the key piece that makes it profitable for the farmer? Exploited immigrant labor, you know? So without that exploitable immigrant labor, the profit margins of even a very well-run, very respectful, environmentally organic farm, it's not, I'm not saying it's impossible for folks to make a living out of it or to do it ethically. There are examples. Actually, Singing Frog Farms, which is a farm up in Sebastopol area, they have been really diligent about trying to create a profit model where they're actually able to able to pay laborers year-round, right? To have as much year-round labor as possible rather than seasonal, because that basically enables families to be farm workers to have a real living rather than be scrambling all the time. There's different ways in which people are figuring out how to do it ethically and with some profit. But I guess I'm just pointing out that the way it is right now is totally skewed against it being profitable to do good by the earth and do good by your workers. And especially in the urban context, because of your own cost of living, it's like if you can't imagine paying immigrant urban, laborers, then paying like even someone who's native, it's just not likely to happen, because you're going to end up paying them the same thing that the immigrant farm worker would get, and that just doesn't work if you're trying to pay rent in San Francisco. So I think it's really about the scale, but it's really more about how it relates to the larger system. So part of that is there is a narrative in the food movement to some degree I agree with, which is that people need to learn to pay more for their food, right? But we can't actually ask that of everybody if people are struggling to survive just day to day and be like, oh, well, you just need to pay more for your tomatoes. Like, that's not gonna work, right? So it's about, fundamentally, you have to change the entire economic system that doesn't reward the large bulk of people for the work that they do enough to survive easily so that they can pay extra money for better produced food. Without getting to that point, we're not going to really see a lot of urban farms, I don't think, flourish without what essentially I've seen them flourish with, which is unpaid and underpaid labor. I'm not fundamentally against the notion of people working for free, because I think sometimes in political activism, the creation of community and the creation of family, we do a lot of things for free, and that's not a bad thing. It's more about, is it done for exploitative person? Is someone extracting a surplus based on your labor? And so most of the projects that I've seen succeed and succeed over time is because people are willing to put in labor for less than, either no compensation or something less than they would get if they actually worked whatever job that they were able to get. So I do hope we work towards more models like Planting Justice, where they're figuring out ways to provide living wage jobs for people that leverage a lot of different income streams, not necessarily just the produce that's grown on the farm.
The name of that other farm was Singing Frog? Is that
Oh, Singing Frog.
Singing Frog.
Yeah, and they're like they're experimental. They're now 8 years into their production, and they're also very good about, they'll share their information with other farms because they want to see this model produced, but they're basically a no-till farm, right? So they're very diligent about all they do is add organic matter all the time.
How much food do you think urban farms could supply if it really spread and we took every vacant lot in San Francisco?
So the historical precedent usually people mention is the Victory Gardens of World War II. There's Victory Gardens in World War I as well, but the ones in World War II were a little bit more record kept. And so during that period, approximately 43% of all fruits and vegetables that were consumed in cities across the country were grown within the city. So that's less than half, but that's still pretty good for just urban gardens and the production. And remember, I was talking about fruits and vegetables, because I think we need to be clear for food activists, we need to be clear about what kind of food we're talking about, and I think that the reality is that it is pretty easy for all of us to be involved in growing our own fruits and vegetables. The techniques are relatively easy, and the amount of space it takes is relatively doable for an urban context. If we're talking about our protein or our carbohydrate sources, it gets a lot more difficult. I mean, potatoes do provide a lot of carbohydrates, but it's just the diversity of things you need to grow and the amount of space you need to grow it in gets a little bit more difficult. So I think it's important to have a nuanced version of what food we're talking about. How much are we realistically going to produce in the city? Because I think also it's a pushback against people who say, oh, well, you'll never grow all your own food in the city. Well, maybe that's not our goal in the first place. Maybe we're trying to grow self-sufficiency or self-reliance without needing to be completely autonomous. It's not like the city is going to be a citadel where nothing comes in. It's no, it's about respectful, ecological, just relations between the city and its hinterlands. And so maybe there still is going to be a role for the agricultural regions for their much larger spaces and the kinds of resources they have. And as long as we can close that cycle and actually return fertility to those spaces and not be doing as we do now, shit into a thing of water, put that water in with a bunch of chemicals, mix it up, hope that it returns it all right, and then spit it out to the bay. That's one of the broken aspects of the system is we don't think about food in terms of its way out. So yeah, 43, I think that if we were really passionate about it and we had support, meaning support from all levels of government support, in terms of it being valued above and beyond the development value of land, I think 40% is totally realistic.
To add to that, there's a study that was done in Oakland to try and ask and answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember the numbers?
I don't actually remember the numbers of that one. It was lower than that though, right?
The Oakland study was only on public land.
Yes, that was
it
what
was
it was.
on
And I think it was like
empty lots.
I want to say it was like 12% or something like that.
Yeah, 12 to 15. It was less than 20%, but that was not considering all of the backyard, rooftop, private spaces. That was considering, because that study then was taken up by the Oakland Food Policy Council to try and leverage municipal or city government resources to develop this. So it was very much saying that, look, aside from dealing with private property, people's backyards and rooftops, just using the public land that we could convert, and they did soil quality studies too, which is important.
Yeah.
Because Oakland's an industrial town. We have a lot of heavy metal contamination to deal with. So it wasn't just what land is there, it was what land is there and can be used to grow food. And even with all of these brackets, it still came up with, like in the teens percentage-wise.
Yeah. Which I just want to mention one other thing, which is that if we are thinking in terms of being driven by social justice as our primary lens, then 12 to 15% is no small matter, because for some people that's an incredible resource, right? So it's not about necessarily we're just named this narrative of feeding everybody, right? It's about who does that food go to.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how things used to be before we had cars and before we had refrigeration and preservation of food. Ultimately, you had cities that were the size of San Francisco that were able to be more or less self-reliant with their hinterlands, right? Have that relationship, and it worked out, obviously, for thousands of years, right? Maybe it's more challenging for a city like New York, but the models have existed and they've been successful. The challenge becomes, why are we not able to do that now with all this technology and all this advantages? And it sounds to me like it's a lot of political challenges, where the money is coming from, who's making these decisions, and how disconnected they are from everything.
I think that's very much it.
Yeah.
It really comes down to
we
that.
don't want to.
Yeah.
Somebody doesn't want to.
Yeah.
Well, because again, what I was talking about, the sort of the hourglass model, there's a lot of people who are producers in the world scale. A lot of people who are producers, a lot of people who are consumers, but really a lot of the wealth is being suctioned into this small number of people. And, we talk about a broken food system, but the food system actually works really well for those people, and the same way, the people who are making millions of dollars from developing high-end luxury housing or high-end luxury developments. There was a really good article recently about this global phenomenon of usually foreign capital buying up large areas in cities and creating these huge mega luxury developments. Those interests are gaining much from the destruction of whatever food system might be displaced by these developments, right? So it's not like they have no interest in preventing urban sprawl or preventing the destruction of farmland. It's not really in certain people's interests. And so I think, it is ultimately political. At the same time, it's economic in the sense that, the decision making being driven by economic concerns is partially why it goes in one direction and not the other. And that's why I understand when some people have this notion of if we can make urban farming profitable, then won't it change the calculus so that people will go more towards it? I don't buy it, because I think it's fundamentally sort of skewed.
Yeah, it's not allowed.
Yeah, so I don't think it's in itself going to do that. Same way that buying organic foods, it's part of the solution potentially, but it's definitely not going to be the only solution that causes change.
I didn't. Can I?
Was that name?
So yeah, I had a few questions. So you talked quite a bit about how urban farming, is shown to not really be profitable and all these things. And a question that I've had is, there seems to be really a big difference in how people are talking. People are saying the same thing around the world and in rural areas and urban areas. Everybody's kind of talking about broken food system and what do we do, and ultimately the idea is kind of bring the system back, like the value back. You were talking about, it belongs to the conglomerates, and like we want to bring that back. So everybody's kind of saying the same thing, but in different ways and coming from different places. And so it seems like there's just such a huge gulf between what rural farmers are saying and what they're coming from, and people in the cities. And my impression is that when a rural farmer is an activist and they're taking time off farming to be an activist and to write and talk and all these things, it really is based in a labor it's a labor fight. It's no different from somebody who works in any other type of field, joining a union and going and fighting and organizing and all these things, because it's like, well, we're selling our beans and it's not, we're not getting paid enough, or we're being displaced, but I need to continue to make my living. That's not the only concern, but that's one of the
cultural issues and gender things, but
but that's one of the main kind of bases. And then in the city, it seems like a lot of where we're coming from is more of a kind of not only social justice, but we're thinking about the social justice issues often from the perspective of the eaters and not from the perspective of the other. Yeah, exactly. And so is that part of the problem, that maybe these things could actually be more sustainable, or we could find ways to be profitable if there wasn't that gulf, and if there was more of this, thinking about it, starting to think more about the production side of it, with more of a labor perspective into it, and joining, not having that disconnect. Like, I know also from the rural areas, there isn't, from what I've seen, there isn't much of an interest in connecting with people in the city doing this type of activism, because they feel like it's just such a completely different world, that there's a lot of affinity, but really they're not coming from the same place. So is that kind of where a solution could be?
I think halfway. I think we'll definitely the labor point. So one sort of way I could frame it is that if we actually advocated and had success in the realm of labor in the food system in our own state, not even our country, just our state, if laborers in our food system were paid more, paid better for the work that they do, it would skew that price point so that the better produced foods would actually not be so expensive in comparison to the stuff produced by the dominant food system, right? It's cheap partially because of the ways that laborers are exploited. And that's true for meat production, it's true for vegetable production, it's true for basically every major area. So that's one way we can see that, yes, labor is fundamental to why we have these consumer side problems, right? But the other thing that I think is so crucial that often gets left out, and it's challenging to sort of connect across these divides, is that ultimately what this has to do with is land. It has to do with the control of and use of land, who gets to decide what lands are used for what. And right now, so in one way is because many of the folks who are in the sort of peasant producer movements, they often have a relationship to land that's relatively, this is making a generalization because there's many different kinds of people, but many people have sort of relative tenure security, where they have their family farm, they have their own space, where the labor that they exert on it is not operating necessarily within the sort of capitalist system that we, city dwellers, really have to. We have no land base to speak of, right? We rely on our labor power in order to survive. And they rely on their labor power as well, but it's mediated through their own production on their own farm, right? And so I guess what I'm saying is the same way we have our issue of intense displacement, where we don't get to decide that this is a good use of the land because it's growing food for people in an ecological way, because if the price point of that land is that it's worth more, someone has a reason to take it and turn it into a building that you can't afford to live in, that's what's going to happen, right? So it's really about this issue of control of land. I think that connects consumers and our consumer mind, which is basically all about being unconnected to any land and having no basis for our own production, and then folks in the rural community who don't want to present like that they're fine because they have their land, because many are struggling to maintain their lands. Many people are landless peasants, you know. So it's that I think fundamentally we have something in common in the terms of labor and in terms of land. And I think if the more that the food movement can think about that rather than, you know, I mean, I care about the environment, but I think this lens of the environment, especially the idea of relocalization, localization is a simplistic solution to a complex global problem. And I think clearly food systems should be more localized than they are now. But the reality is that the food system we exist in globally is only 10 to 25% moving across national borders anyway. Most of the food that's produced and consumed around the globe isn't being distributed through the global food system anyway. Am I correct, Gustavo? That's the statistics that I've read.
Well, grains are the things that move the most.
Yeah, exactly. Soy and wheat, and to some degree meat, and like high-end things like flowers. These might be being moved across borders, but people, again, fruits and vegetables are not actually. And so we have this illusion that that's the food system we exist in, and the localization paradigm is what's going to solve this environmental, carbon, whatever problem we're talking about. But really, it's about control over land and the rights to land and labor and its reward and who gets to decide how much. Those are the fundamental issues, I think, of the food system.
So go ahead.
There's a very inspiring example that I've learned about in Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. They have, I think, 6 or 8 different plots in the city, urban agriculture. The largest one is an urban farm, I think at 2 acres or so. And they are not only producing in some of these plots inside Detroit itself, but the most important thing, and this is why I bring it up, is that the Black Community Food Security Network was set up with farmers, with black farmers outside of the city, and not just in Michigan, but in Illinois and another, going way down to Louisiana, using the historical family connections of the people that moved to Detroit, and they basically use a way to have distribution points that are run by the community for the community that are sourcing from these farmers. So at the same time that they're supporting and paying, you know, their own farmers and their own families, in their own communities inside the city and out, they're also bringing in this food right into the black communities of Detroit. Well, to Detroit.
So I had a question and also an observation. So what I've noticed here in San Francisco over the last few years is a certain revaluation of land by the community, right? And what I mean by that is that all of a sudden individuals, not individuals, but groups of people, and especially neighborhoods, are starting to value empty lots, right? And it's mostly for housing, of course, but then you have groups like Bullet who are also mixing in not only housing, but gardening, and ultimately going to saying, well, can we achieve some measure of sovereignty, right? Community sovereignty. Do you think that this is going to increase, that we're going to have this revaluation at an urban level of the value of land, or is it just an anomaly that we're experiencing in San Francisco?
I'd like to think so. I think things, especially like the model of the land trust, which has typically been a rural thing. I mean, it's not even that old of a concept, but you know, the land trust being applied to urban space, and the idea of like, can we take land and take it out of speculative markets completely and have it only serve the social function that it should serve? Like, that's a new thing, and it's spreading pretty widely, and the model is actually seeming to be economically viable even in a place like San Francisco, which is hard to believe. So I do think that there's sort of more like academic side, because I study some of this, you know, there's people who are talking about the right to the city and these different ways in which communities are starting to assert their rights over land. I don't think it's necessarily like a foregone, you know, like victory, or, you know, like, oh yeah, we're already figured it out, but definitely that there's models and there's efforts that are showing that communities organizing for various things, you know, like you mentioned, it's like some people's concern is housing, some people's concern is open space or recreational space, or, you know, spaces of worship, whatever it is. It's like there's a lot of people who are coming to the same realization that we need to think about land first and foremost. So I'm hopeful that some of the places that have not been hit with displacement epidemics the way that San Francisco has, are like able to leapfrog and actually see, oh, hey, we can avoid this process by preemptively community organizing and getting the structures in place to keep land out of that market. I think there's also models internationally for, I was gonna mention, and I know someone talked about Occupy the Farm, but there are models, at least internationally, more about proactive reclaiming of land and saying, no, actually, the whole point of land is to benefit social use, and so there's different precedents for that. I think here in the US, for various reasons, I think that we have a hard time doing those kinds of actions and being accepted politically widely, but I still think it's like another option.
So that actually, what you just said brings me to the question I wanted to ask, which was that, as you say, in the US, there doesn't seem to be kind of culturally this idea of like agrarian reform, it just doesn't, it's not like that here. Gustavo was talking about MST, and tomorrow if somebody came and said, we're gonna start this movement, like it wouldn't take hold. So I'm wondering, like, when you guys...
It's funny. I just want to say it's funny because like you could definitely look at the US population and say we're a bunch of landless workers. There's a lot of landless workers in the US. But to make a landless workers movement, people would be like, what do you mean by that?
So because you guys were talking about, urban farming, and it doesn't produce so much, but actually it produces, it's not insignificant and all these things. But like, my question is, do these things, like what I'm hoping or what I'm asking is, do these sorts of projects have also a value, not just in terms of what you're producing and who's getting the food or that sort of immediate kind of thing, or maybe, it's making the space more green or whatever, but do these sorts of projects, if we say tomorrow let's start, a new space and right next door, a little community garden, like does this have sort of social value where by doing these sorts of things, we're kind of reconnecting with, oh, it actually is really cool to have some land and to grow stuff, and actually it is important. And so if in 2 years we had our own American version of like an MST leader who wanted to start, like people would be more, let's go. You know
that you just basically explained in simple words, non-academic words, the last academic paper that I wrote.
Oh.
Because essentially there's this concept that's been advanced in relationship to the MST of agrarian citizenship, and that a lot of the work of MST is to cultivate this agrarian citizenship where people see themselves as citizens, but in relationship to the process of food production and the importance of an agrarian awareness, right? And so I argue in this paper that Occupy the Farm is an example of how these projects, even if in that case it was successful in accessing land, but oftentimes even if we have these very difficult processes of trying to access land, these projects that are about that are educating people about food systems in a way that cultivates an agrarian citizenship, where people start to see themselves, like that's the whole point, is no one or very few people see themselves as landless workers, right? But the more people that see themselves as landless, first of all, and as workers, the more we understand and cultivate this consciousness, the more that there becomes the basis for a political movement to demand things like land access. Right. Like we don't have a reason for land access because who's going to even work that land? Right. But the more that we know, we want, a big thing also is like, a lot of these projects are working in poor communities or African American communities where there's like, a lot of times there's this feeling of like, I'm not going to work for free on land. That's where at Alemany Farm, there's a lot of this issue of like, some people are not going to work for free on land because of the historical context of that. But when my friend Brandy does it, she teaches it in a way where her youth, they're like understanding these broader implications that are not just about working land per se, and it's divorcing them from this idea of working land is slavery, and they actually see the empowering the basis of it and are making the connections. That's the kind of thing that creates the basis for a politicized culture that says, no, this is our right as people of this planet to have land to grow food healthily on. And so I agree entirely. That's my biggest hope is indeed that's why we're doing it over a long period of time, right? It's not going to happen soon, but we're laying the foundation for the fact that later on, and my additional hope is that the whole point is people will see the connections between these agrarian issues and the issues of, say, the urban center, and the fact that we as urban people, even if we're not going to have anything to do with growing food, we also have a right to have a say in what land gets used for.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to close up the day because it's already 7:30.
All right, well, sorry it took too long.
No, it was perfect timing, actually. So it's been a very long day, but for me, it's been an amazing day. And thank you so much for coming.
Yeah,
I-